We're here in Salon QP with Michael Clerizo, watch author and journalist for the Wall Street Journal. And we know that Michael has said a few things that sometimes might have been controversial. And for us at the Watches TV, something that is very important in terms of the watchmaking industry is that if watchmaking is only seen as like a marketing product, then this industry is in danger. And I believe Michael goes a bit further than that with his comments.
The comment you're referring to, Marc-Andre, is there's no such thing as a trend in the watch industry. And you'd like me to justify that statement. Okay, well, first of all, I think it's a lazy way of dealing with the watch industry, the intellectually lazy way. We've always dealt with trends in the fashion industry, in the music business, in movies, in shoes. So why not deal with trends in the watch industry? But it's a very intellectually lazy way. The other thing I have to say is my statement applies to a segment of the watch industry. If we look at watches that are under, say, $1,500 US, yes, there are trends there. Those are the quartz watches that are made by hundreds of millions, or they're the watches from the fashion brands. And yes, of course they follow trends, but they also don't last very long. Now let's look at watches that are about $5,000 or Swiss francs up. In that part of the watch industry, trends are very rare. I will give you an example of one. A few years ago, we started to see far fewer gold bracelets and a lot more leather bracelets, but that was because the cost of gold had risen.
It was just pragmatic.
It was purely pragmatic, because if you sell a watch for $30,000 and you put a solid gold bracelet on it, the price now becomes $45,000. Who's going to do that? Nobody. Nobody wants to spend that much, or very few people. But when we're talking about that, let's say, luxury end of the watch industry, no, there aren't trends. There are instead something called developments. There are things that take decades to play out. Yes, it's true we saw watches get bigger. They actually started to get bigger in the late 70s. They got bigger through the 80s as more and more people tried to put pocket watch complications into a wristwatch. And that was the reason watches got thicker. It wasn't because of any fashion desire. It wasn't because of a desire to make the watch look bigger on your wrist just for the sake of having a bigger watch. It was because people wanted to get pocket watch complications into wristwatches. That took place over years, over decades, and that's not a trend. That's a development. Now, occasionally we'll see a lot of blue dials one year, but blue dials have been around for a very long time. The same thing with gray dials. We do see ultra-thin watches today, but there are some brands that have made ultra-thin watches since the 19th century. And this is another point. When we're talking about watch brands, particularly, I'll just name four: Patek Philippe, Audemars Piguet, Vacheron Constantin, and Breguet. They're all well over 100 years old. In fact, I think they're all over 150 years old. And when they develop a watch, they look more to their own lineage than they do to any outside fashion trend. The next thing you have to consider is the amount of money that goes into developing a watch movement. It's millions, and it can take years. And when you develop a mechanical watch movement, you have to think 5 years in advance just for the basic movement. And you also have to think how you can add complications to the movement, what else you can do to it, and that puts you even further into the future. You can't possibly anticipate any kind of trend that far in advance. You have to stay true to your own roots.
But does it imply, I mean, some of those brands that you talked about, even though they have multiple families of products, they're often associated with one product into their product catalog. So is that star product, star timepiece, that represents the trend of that particular brand then?
No, I don't think so. What would be the star piece for Patek Philippe? The Nautilus? The Nautilus has been around since what, the late 70s, 80s? If we consider a brand like AP, the Royal Oak's been around for decades. I don't think that is at all evidence of a trend. Again, is evidence of a conscious effort to develop a brand signature, to develop a look for a watch that distinguishes the brand in the marketplace.
So, I mean, we take the example of kind of the ultimate example with Rolex and some kind of longevity in terms of design. What do you think about that?
Well, Rolex is a law unto itself. Rolex has never followed a trend, never will. They have always done things differently, and they do things extremely well. Many of their designs are based on designs from the 1960s. They got it right then. They know they got it right. They make close to 1 million watches a year. They could probably sell 2 million if they made them. There's another interesting thing about the watch industry. You always have to make fewer watches than you can sell. You always have to keep the demand there. You can't ever answer it. So again, that's another reason for not having trends. But no, Rolex hasn't changed for decades, nor should it. There was criticism of their new Daytona watch because the new Daytona came out. It had a very nice icy blue dial and a chestnut brown bezel. And people said, well, why didn't you make the anniversary watch bigger? Why didn't you put a tourbillon on it? Why didn't you, I don't know, make it so it would do your taxes or something? And this is just a joke. Rolex is Rolex, and they do what they do, and they do it very well.
And talking about the sizes of watches, I mean, we've seen watches become bigger and bigger. Maybe today going back the other route a little bit. Isn't that a trend for you?
No, again, that's a development. Because you always have to remember when we're talking about the luxury end of the market, which these days is most of the market, by the way, we're talking about the movement as being the most important component of the watch. And yes, people may have made bigger cases for a few years and then decide, well, look, we can put out the same movement without the complications, and suddenly the watch gets thinner. But again, that is all part of the development of the movement. It is not any kind of trend. I consider trends something that come from the outside. They can often be forced upon an industry, any industry, not just the watch industry. But the watch industry has developments, and those are really evolutionary. They can take decades to play out, and they are usually unique to a brand. If you want an example of someone who got it wrong, we all know what happened to Zenith when they went down the road of doing bizarre watches. Sales dried up. They had to bring someone back into the company, Mr. Dufour, who then recreated the great watches from the past, and suddenly sales went up again because the brand was distinct when it was true to its roots. It wasn't distinct when it followed a trend. So again, I think that's just further proof for my theory that there's no such thing as a trend in the watch industry.
That's an interesting thought, and thank you very much for your comment and thoughts precisely.